If you are worried about your water bills going up, or any of your bills going up, you need to pay attention to this story. Water companies have pushed for an 84% hike in water bills, clearly not reading the room very well. The Independent reports water companies are asking for bills to be hiked even higher than they first requested earlier this year, with one company seeking an increase of 84%. The latest requests would see the average bill for customers in England and Wales rise by 40% between now and 2030 to £615 a year. Utilities, including beleaguered Thames Water, have applied to the regulator Ofwat to hike tariffs so they can upgrade their networks, often after years of underinvestment and big payouts to their shareholders. This is what happens when you run a utility system for profit. But don't worry, the Labour government has decided to step in and help by launching the Independent Water Commission. I don't think it's going to do anything, as the BBC reports. Environment Secretary Steve Reed said he had launched the Root and Branch probe to fix the UK's polluted and failing water system. Almost all options will be considered during the review, including reforming or getting rid of Ofwat, which has been criticised for its track record in regulating the industry in England and Wales. You don't say. There are certainly very severe failures of regulation and governance that underpin the problems that we're seeing in the water sector, said Reid. The government has ruled out nationalisation of the sector, which was privatised in the 1980s, as too costly and slow. Instead, the private sector will have to provide the investment needed to upgrade pipes, sewers, and reservoirs to deal with the UK's rising population and climate change. But in order to attract private capital into the sector, it is likely that customers will face higher bills. In fairness, one of the ideas floated was allowing non-profit organisations to run the water companies, but I'd argue that this still leaves the UK water system with a heavy drive to make money for the company bosses, who will want a large salary. A lot of these non-profits are formed and fundamentally a lot of their culture, their advisory boards are often made up of people from the corporate sector. What do you think, Curtis? Do you think that this could work? Am I being too skeptical?
No, of course it's not going to work. It's a very simple fix, and I think everyone knows what we're going to say. It's nationalise it. Nationalise our utilities. You correctly pointed out, there's if you have a public utility for the public good, you don't privatise it, you don't make a profit off of it. Now, I found it really funny. I think it was a couple of months ago, Steve Reed, the environmental secretary, DEFRA, I believe, put out a tweet. And he said, we've secured all this private capital for our water systems. All this money is going to fix our broken equipment and infrastructure. And he put a newspaper clipping on there. But some clever people, which is anyone, zoomed in on the newspaper clipping, and it saw that actually the majority of this capital investment was going to come through higher bills for customers. So what Steve Reed was celebrating is, yes, the companies are going to spend money fixing the issues that they broke in the first place, and you're going to pay for it. And that's essentially what the same plan is now. Now, they are actually lying when they say to the public, when they want to get voted in the general election, we're going to make your life better, we're going to make bills are going to come down. That is a lie if you keep the current system of privatization. Now, the problem with privatization is that it's terrible for investment. Terrible for investment. That's not the goal of many private companies. The goal is to suck as much wealth out of it as possible. It sucks money out of the economy. So when you have a situation where you have a monopoly service like water, you don't want private companies involved, because they're going to try and take their money out of the system through customer bills and are going to spend as little money as possible on investment. And the idea that they turn around and say, right, what we've had for 40 years doesn't work, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to set up a commission. It reminds me of the Child Poverty Task Force. When the debate happened with the two-child benefit cap, multiple human rights organizations and child poverty organizations and researchers said the number one cause to child poverty is the two-child benefit cap, and scrapping that policy will lift 500,000 kids out of poverty. It was an easy policy. You just had to scrap it. Yet the Labour Party decided to remove the whip of several Labour MPs for daring to support children. And instead, they said, what we're going to do is set up a task force, a bullshit little commission that's going to say very little. Either it's going to say, actually, you should scrap the two-child benefit cap, or you should renationalize water, or it's going to give, you know, policies here and there that are going to tinker around the edge. But it's, and this is the thing, what those in the mainstream media, most politicians, particularly the Labour right, I've said this so many times, but I'm going to reiterate it. They always say that the left are so ideological. You're so ideological that you support nationalisation. We're the logical ones, right? We're modernising the Labour Party. I say that privatisation is ideological. It hasn't worked. It's clear if you renationalise these companies, all of the income goes back to the Treasury, and the Treasury will invest. And even if you make a budget surplus, where does that money go? Well, it can go into other public services, unless it's ring fenced, right? Privatization is a failed model. Yet when you've got private capital, you've got companies and CEOs coming to you and giving you loads of money, and you know the Labour Party is a lot. Most of their donors came from private capital. Then that is ideological. And I laugh at the idea that they're saying, okay, well, what we might do is go to non-profits. Here's the thing with non-profits. It's not technically non-profit in the sense that you and I would think about it, right? There's still a profit to be made. People need to get paid for what they do. I'm not saying non-profits are bad, but it doesn't take away the sort of the contradiction between making money and investment. All right, maybe shareholders aren't making money off of a non-profit company, but there's still an incentive to de-invest to make sure that everyone is paid. The beautiful thing about government-run services is that it can run things at a deficit. So let's say that the tax income for that year is a bit lower. Let's say that they're going to go into a budget deficit. Instead of just closing up shop, the government can say, "Well, we can handle this deficit." We run budget deficits all of the time. Some economists even say small budget deficits are good because it means you're providing, you're putting into the private economy. But if you are running things at a deficit on a government level and it's owned by the government, you could just raise taxes and bring in that income. When a private company runs things at a deficit, what do? They make cuts. And that means cuts to investment because Lord knows they're not going to cut their own CEO pay packets, are they? Or they might cut the wages of workers. So it's a very simple solution. But because the Labour Party, just like the Conservative Party, are beholden to capital, are beholden to private money, they're not going to do it. I can't remember her name, but one Labour MP used to be a lobbyist for a private water company. Didn't Angela Smith, who moved to Change UK, the Chiggers, or the Tiggers, they called them. She then went on to work in a private water company too. So it's completely ideological, and this is not going to be fixed. And I don't even know what political strategy they're playing. Sorry, I mean, people are pissed off at the Labour government as is. I mean, it must be a record actually how quickly people will regret this government. But to turn around and say your bills are going to go up and we're not going to fix the problem, it's insane. It's like they want to lose the next election.
Yeah, I do think there really is something to the idea that these people are ideological rather than being logical. It's very much ideological in their thinking. And one of the things that sort of like grounds my sort of thoughts on that is that Margaret Thatcher, of course, is like the birth child of the rolling back. Is sort of her the entire ideology of Thatcherism is rolling back the state. That's how we've ended up with the situation where we are obsessed with moving everything into the private sector, and the private sector must be more efficient. Of course, the one of the principal economists that sort of comes out of that era is Milton Friedman, and Milton Friedman, of course, is more libertarian, more right wing libertarian, and closely related to Milton Friedman. One of his like ideological bedfellows is a man named Ludwig von Mises, who founded the Austrian School of Economics. And the Austrian school, which by the way is very influential over things like Tufton Street, and Liz Truss, that sort of school of economics of like, oh well, if you just roll back the state, then everything will succeed. One of the most insane things that I learned about the Austrian school when I was like looking into it, I've read several of Ludwig von Mises' books while I was doing it. Complete waste of time, by the way. Don't bother, because one of the first things you need to know is that Austrian economists reject empiricism-based economics, as in they don't believe in observing cause and effect and learning things from that. because if they did, their worldview would entirely fall apart because you can just look at the water companies and see, oh, so clearly running these for a profit is not more efficient than the government running it. Like we can just like look and see that. So they have to deny the reality in front of them. Like it is, as you say, a commitment to being ideological over being logical, looking at the facts in front of you, being empirical. And I really do think that on a smaller scale, a much, much smaller scale, I'm not saying that Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are that bad, but I do think they've latched on to a sort of weaker version of that ideological thinking of like just ignore the cause and effect, just ignore all of the evidence. We can't bring it back into the public sector because it will be slow and inefficient in the public sector. And it's like that's an ideological belief. That's not
Well,
based on the empiricism.
I mean, if we talk about, I was going to say Adam Smith actually, and by the way, Adam Smith, he was, back then was considered on the political right. He is a free market capitalist. He's actually got some really good takes, by the way. He'd be considered a leftist, by the way, against landlordism. I misspoke. I
Mm.
meant to say Milton Friedman. Anyone who subscribes to the thought of Milton Friedman and the neoliberal economic agenda, it's completely ideological. Now, they sat at this agenda of the free market, which is that if you allow markets to be free, what will happen is prices will go down, the quality of the whatever it's if you're a clothes shop, the quality of the garments will go up because businesses are competing, to win your custom. Now, in terms, if we were to sit down and just have a conversation about that, that makes logical sense. I understand the ideas behind it, right? It's not like I don't understand free market economics. It's the most frequent political ideology I hear all the time. Unfortunately, it drives me mad, but I hear it every day. But when you apply that to reality, something different happens. What you find is a race to the bottom. You find poverty wages. You find monopolization. You find Walmart, and you don't find this idea that early capitalists believed in, which is a low profit but a very high competitive system, right? It's a nation of small businesses, and small businesses drive the free market, right? That's not what happened. And some people conflate that with, oh, well, what you're talking about now, what we have today is corporatism, right? We need to go back to the free market economics of capitalism, where small businesses are driving the economy. There is no difference between corporatism and capitalism. Corporatism is the end result of capitalism, right? So that's a very interesting point there. But when you apply it to reality, um, of course, these things don't become true. Now, in terms of Keir Starmer, his ideology isn't necessarily free market. His ideology is to be the grown up, right? Richard Reeves, on the other hand, is probably far more ideologically wedded to free market economics. Starmer, in terms of the economy, and he's actually politically pretty stupid. Actually, I mean, he doesn't really know how the economy works. When he first became leader, he actually had people around him telling, "Well, this is what the economy does." But his ideological commitment is to be the grown up, all right? And unfortunately, the current zeitgeist in the political sphere is that the grown up means compromise, but compromise with capital. It means privatization. So I don't think Keir Starmer believes in privatization. But what I think is that, well, nationalization is ideological. I want to be the grown up, therefore, I'm going to be pragmatic. But that in of itself is ideological. People who say they're pragmatists, unfortunately, if you're committed to pragmatism so much that you forget about everything else, then yes, that becomes its own ideology.
Mm. It becomes lacking its own pragmatism because you're so
Right,
obsessed
exactly.
with the idea
Yeah.
of being seen as the grown up. And I do think that yeah, there's definitely something to that. It's funny you should mention Adam Smith. A fact popped into my head about Adam Smith. Of course, he wrote the Wealth of Nations, which is like supposedly where the theory of capitalism comes from. However, and the idea of the invisible hand of capitalism, like spreading wealth. However, Adam Smith was always very clear that his other book, I believe it was called A Theory of Moral Sentiments, was always to be the one that was put first. So Adam Smith always believed that in order for capitalism not to be a race to the bottom, it needed a framing of moral sentiments. It needed a moral framing first. And it's interesting that's always kind
It's
of
essentially
the
the very very old fashioned social democrat in a way. I mean, this other book
mm,
is states, making sure that the wealth of nations doesn't go outside its parameters. And a lot of people who draw from Adam Smith, who become free market extremists, misunderstand his work.
mm. Yeah, to a huge extent. I don't think I wouldn't regard his work as uh, progressive or socialist, but it
No,
was
of course
certainly
not.
more progressive or socialist than a lot of the people who defend it nowadays.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.